two metabolic pathways, but really effective if you have had to go down the path with immunotherapy or even worse, chemotherapy. Autophagy decreases the side effects, which can be quite horrific if you've experienced or you know people that have experienced that particular journey. So basically fasting's demonstrated that the refeeding phase is a hugely important thing. So you might have heard of 5-2 fasting, which is not really this concept. That's just a weight loss tool. That's the concept where 5 days you eat what you like, 2 days you cut your calories down. You need to get an app, they're free, the calorie counting app, and figure out what you can eat, but you basically cut your calories down to 700 calories a day, and that's not autophagy. Just understand, we'll go back to autophagy in a moment, and the best strategy to achieve that, and it's a really cool thing to do. But this is a good weight loss tool, and one of the benefits of that 5-2 fasting, the 2 days where you have just 700 calories, is that you can't, because part of that 700 calories, you can't have your beer or your glass of wine or your 5 glasses of wine. And what is essentially an alcohol-drenched society, that's a pretty cool thing to at least cut alcohol, because most, even the baby boomers now, everyone has their glass of wine. Every movie you see people are drinking wine the whole way through, and it's sort of part of, I don't know if you've seen the studies, but it was an Australian study published last year where they showed that ethanol, which is what alcohol converts to, is actually this far behind nicotine as a primary root cause of cancer. It's a major driver of your likelihood of cancer is how much you drink. So it's pretty cool to at least shut down 2 days a week where you can't because there's too many calories in wine. When you have your glass or 2 glasses or half a bottle, which is a common thing that people drink with meals, myself included often, what you're doing from a calorie perspective, that's slightly more than most meals, the calories. So you had 2 meals that night, so obviously you can lose weight if you stop that for 2 or 3 days. But I have doctors that attend my courses, and I have lots of natural health practitioners and so forth, and I'll often share their results about what's working for them. And so often in the last couple of years, I've heard people talking about the tremendous results they see when they encourage this something that's called 16-8 fasting. So it's very simple and something any of us can do. You have your last meal. So first thing to understand is that autophagy kicks in 14 hours after your last food. So when we're talking food, we mean you've got to have 16 hours, so you're going to do it at night, so you're sleeping through at least half of that, but you can't have proteins, fats and carbohydrates, any of them, even the slightest amount of them, or you blew it. So you have your last meal, you can eat what you like, you can have your glass of wine, you have your couple of beers, whatever you want, but you have your last meal at 6:30 and you're finished by 6:30. And then your next meal, and you can have the most delicious, I've been doing it a bit recently, I need a little bit of gut fat, but basically I go off and have a breakfast that I leave it, if you can leave it longer than 10:30, and I'm usually working, I've got a lot on, so I might leave it till 11:30, but then you have your sourdough and you have your avocado and you can have some egg and whatever you want, have a really nice breakfast and really savour it, but basically after your 6:30 that's it. You can't have another glass of wine, you can drink black coffee or herbal tea, but you can't put sugar in it, you can't have milk in it, you can't have carbohydrates at all. And then in the morning it's quite interesting because that cup of black coffee, you actually, if you haven't had black coffee before, no sugar in it, you actually learn to really like that sort of bit of flavour, but it shuts down your hunger and it works really effectively so that you can quite easily go through to 10:30. So understand 8:30 you've had your 14 hours, so that's the critical time. That's when autophagy kicks in for those last 2 hours. So if you can stretch it out to 11:30, well then you've got 50% more autophagy. You've got another hour. Instead of 2 hours, you've got 3 hours. So it's a really, really cool thing to be aware of that. And honestly, you've just got to go and look at the studies. Just Google studies into autophagy or go to ChatGPT and ask for a 2,000-word article on the benefits of autophagy. And how many of you are familiar with ChatGPT? So half of you have. So this is this whole potentially hugely dangerous issue of AI and its potential. Elon Musk and 5 other billionaires, Elon put 100 million into it, and now he's saying we've got to stop it because we can't. The Microsoft version, one of the Microsoft engineers has just resigned because he's saying we don't even know how it's working now. It's gone beyond us. I don't know if you saw the philosopher, what's his name? He's got quite a lot of YouTube clips. He's got the 12 principles of life. What's his name? Yeah, Jordan Peterson. I don't know if you saw Jordan's most recent YouTube clip where he said the world changed as from today. So he went on to the pro version of ChatGPT, and he said, okay, well, I want you to review my previous works, there's 12 principles of life. I want you to write a new book, the 13th principle of life, based on a logical extension of my previous work, but something new, something creative. I want you to build into that the philosophical underpinnings of Buddhism between whatever period and about 3 other philosophical traditions. He brought in all these just ridiculously complex philosophical or challenge for anyone, and immediately began writing, and there was a new book, and he said it was as good as I could have done myself. And that's what we're staring down the barrel of this, that universities are terrified because, you know, you literally can go and it'll write you beautiful English, really well done. It'll write anything, you know. There's so many jobs that are threatened, 300 million of them is the most current estimate, that basically, I mean, graphic designers, the sister program to, you can just say like I paid 10 grand for the logo for Nutritech. You know, I wanted a really good one. I hired one of the world's best logo designers, said what it represented and what I wanted to show on that. Well, I said, I just hypothetically said, okay, I want to have a new logo. Here's my mission statement. Here's my goals and principles, and I want that reflected in the logo. And 1 minute later, 4 completely original logos come on. I said, I like that third one, but I'd like this little tweak, and the tweak's done instantly, and you're doing this just with your mouth. You're just talking. I mean, it's just insane. The sexual thing of it, I don't know if you saw the Four Corners show, but there's this huge fall-off in birth rates. I don't know why I'm digressing into this, but there's a huge fall-off in birth rates in countries like Japan and Korea because the young, but like the guys are sitting there, they can get this bot that will learn completely everything about them, and when they come home from work, it just chats them, and it learns progressively. And it makes humorous comments, and it makes really informed things. And how did you fight with Bill go? And, that was about that project that you disagree with them on or whatever. And it gets more and more intuitive to the point you've got this wonderful partner. And then you have your little mechanised vagina, and then it learns all your sexual preferences, and it talks you through while you're masturbating the vagina. And they thought, well, I don't need a woman anymore, so the birth rate's falling. I mean, who would have thought? What a bizarre world. But anyway, I've digressed so much in picturing that scenario. Okay, well, let's go back to this, intermittent fasting. So another simple thing that everyone can do, and this is more than just, this is not really autophagy, because this is just a weight loss tool that can be tremendous value because it can serve as a huge injection of all important antioxidants. So this is a thing called a juice fast, and so this is basically a 7-day cycle. First 2 days, just eating fruit salads as much as you like. You don't feel hungry. You can eat, but you can't have protein. You can't have cheese. You can't have nuts or anything in that salad. But you can eat as much as you like of anything in terms of fruit and vegetables. And then 3 days where it's just those cold pressed juices. And you might sort of, you can have like 7 glasses a day. You don't need to feel hungry. But I mean, if you have, like say a savoury juice where you're going to include things like carrot and tomato, and you might put some herbs in there and try to make it a bit spicy, and then you just finish it off with a whole bunch of berries. It's all you're eating, so you can be as, as luxurious as you like in terms of the ingredients, and you might have beetroot in with that carrot to get all the benefits of anthocyanins from the beetroot and so forth. And you're pouring that back, and you have 3 days of just those juices, and then 2 more days of back just fruit and salads. And usually it's a 3 kilo weight loss, but there's a clarity that kicks in at the end of that thing that you just got this insane. If you've not done it before, there's this, I guess it's part of the cleansing process, but there's just this clarity. You're just in the moment with everything around you. It's just a lovely feeling. So that's juice fasting. I was speaking at a health conference in New Zealand on the foreshores of Auckland Harbour, and one of the people on the stage, sharing the bill with was a woman called Victoria Butenko, and she's the author of a multi-million selling book called Green for Life, and she's considered to be the mother of what has become quite a major health strategy globally, which is called green smoothies. So I had dinner with Victoria, and she told me her story, and she said basically herself, her husband, and the 2 children, between them had 8 degenerative diseases. They had things like asthma, and one of them had type 2 diabetes, and anyway, 8 things between them. And they're taking more and more drugs, which is the model. I mean, just so you understand the bankruptcy of the modern medical machine from that symptom treating perspective, the largest killer on the planet remains coronary heart disease, just ahead a black caviar's nose length ahead of cancer, which will catch up probably by Christmas. Number 3 was stroke, and has been for a long time. Stroke is now number 4. Our new number 3 is prescription medicine, has become our 3rd largest killer. So the average 60-year-old in the US is on 16 drugs, and by the time you're 65, it's 22 drugs. And that's called multiple drug therapy that kills you. And part of the story is that drugs work on the principle of shutting something down. You look at the world's most widely sold drug, which is the lipid-lowering medications, as I said, 23.2 billion. And what's their mode of action? When you shut something down, you shut down the building block for cholesterol. It's called mevalonate. All 9 of the different drugs that do that all work on the same principle. They shut down mevalonate. You say, that's pretty good, I'm not making cholesterol. Well, yeah, cholesterol is really important. You can't make bile, it's an antioxidant. You can't make testosterone with that, it's not a poison. But the story with mevalonate, the body never does one thing. Mevalоnate's the building block for another substance, which is arguably much, much more important than cholesterol. It's called coenzyme Q10, or ubiquinol, and it's important as relative to the fact it's in every cell, and it's really concentrated in cells that are very active, like your brain with 50,000 thoughts a day, or your heart that's got to go boom, boom for every second of your life. It's jam-packed with, it has a requirement for very large amounts of coenzyme Q10 because it's involved in the mitochondria, the energy-generating section of the cells, and of course those two cells need a lot of energy. And you shut down the building block, you shut down coenzyme Q10, which increases. In Japan, it's considered the most powerful heart medicine. You go on a prescription for life of coenzyme Q10 with any heart issue at all. It could just be angina or a heartbeat skip or whatever. It's considered that important. And you're taking this medication, the world's largest selling medication, for your heart, and it shuts down the most important thing for your heart. It's kind of a bankrupt system, and that's how all of them. So the multiple drug therapy works on the fact that, yeah, it did one thing, but then it shut down something else. So you take something for that, and it builds and builds until the drugs kill you, which is, not a good outcome. And that's where she was heading with the 8, getting back on track finally. That's where she was heading with the 8 conditions. They were just taking more and more stuff and getting sicker. And so she said, well, she'd done a degree in biology back in another world before she was married and had a different thing and so forth. And she'd always been fascinated with chimpanzees because they got 99.72 of the same genes we've got. They're the closest thing to a human being is the chimpanzees. That's why they use the poor little buggers in tests and so forth. And so basically, she said, well, what do they eat? Well, they're not vegetarians, as perhaps they've got the same teeth that we have. Maybe we weren't designed to be that. They'll be vegetarian for a couple of weeks. They'll eat nuts and shoots and roots and leaves and so forth, and fruit. And then they kill a monkey and they top up on the things. Maybe there's a lesson there. I'm not saying that, but you wonder. And they have very low levels of illness. They're very, very healthy. And so she says, what percentage of their diet, if they're so close to us, is greens? And she finds it's 55% of their calorific intake. They wrap everything in a leaf. There's so much. She said, okay, well, what's our calorific intake in terms of greens? And she finds that the average Western diet is 5% greens and vegetarians are 20% greens. And so she said, what would happen if you upped it to that 55%? And she found, well, you haven't even got the chewing reflex to eat that big bowl of greens. So she said, what would happen if we use a high-powered blender, and it must be one of these 2-horsepower blenders to do it really effectively, because if you put it in there for too long, you oxidise a lot of the goodies. So you want a real quick whoosh, and you've got it micronized, basically. Why don't we make a liquid, using kale or silver beet or whatever, and make this? And then, of course, the kids said, we're not drinking that crap. And then she realised that, when we juice fruit, a third of it, or sometimes half of it, is that mulch that we sort of give it to the worm farm or throw out or whatever. And of course, when you micronise, it's all in there, so the flavour's quite intense. And so you could use grapes or pineapple or bananas, very commonly used in a green smoothie, and the flavour will actually not overwhelm, but certainly take off some of the edge of that chlorophyll flavour, and the kids liked it. And she found you needed to drink 1.2 litres to get your 55% calorific intake of green smoothies. This is no small challenge. It's 4 big glasses, 4 300ml glasses, to the point that you had to drop a meal because you got so much of it. She said, let's do a 6-month challenge. So they forced it down. You can make it quite pleasant flavour and just throw it back. But at the end of 6 months, all 8 diseases were gone. literally all 8 degenerative diseases. So she was writing a little column, because she's a nutritionist, in her local town. It's a little town of 10,000. So she put a challenge out there. Who would like to, try the 6-month challenge? And the second half of her multi-million selling book is about people who did that, and the ridiculous cure rates of things like type 2 diabetes and a whole spectrum of issues that were controlled or changed via that huge increase in the uptake of greens, and hence her term as the mother of green smoothies. And it really is wonderful. How many of you use green smoothies as part of your diet? Oh, a few, not many, but 4 or 5. Wonderful inclusion in the diet. Now, the things that you can put in there are kind of limitless, but you basically got to have that high powered, like you're using a Vitamix or one of these thermoblends, the German model, something that'll do it real quick. But Brazil nuts are a wonderful inclusion for Brazil nuts. Brazil nut is 25 micrograms, highest known source of selenium, but has all the cofactors that determine the uptake. So the kind of therapeutic dose for selenium is 200 micrograms per day. Brazil nuts are 25 micrograms per day, and you only have 4, so that's only 100, but you can do that. It's a very strong therapeutic dose because all the cofactors are present in the natural food that determine the uptake, including very high levels of vitamin E, which is the most important of several things that govern the utilisation of selenium. So Brazil nuts, whack them in there. You don't do that, continue doing that. You can pull right back to 1 or 2 because you're going to top up your selenium quite quickly at 4 nuts. Pumpkin seeds, wonderful source of zinc. A lot of people have problems with taking zinc supplements. It makes them crook. You see probably 1 in 5 people have issues with that, and really important because many of us are zinc deficient. Pumpkin seed is the highest plant source of zinc, and it's got really good cofactors in there that will help. So pumpkin seeds can go into your green smoothie. We mentioned the fact that we're all so seriously deficient in omega-3 fats. It should be 2 to 1, it's 20 to 1 is the average. How can we fix that? You can go and have a test to find out where you're at. It's $88, $80 plus GST. Go to a naturopath. There's a good test to show complete fatty acid profile and see what your ratio is. I'm suggesting you'll be surprised. I thought surely I'm going to be reasonable. Mind you, I hadn't done anything much with omega-3 for quite some time. I was 17 to 1. I was horrified, so I did something about that. Now, the best thing, I'm digressing consistently, but the best thing that you can do about that is actually Australia's oldest man a couple of years back when the ABC interviewed him on his 107th birthday and said, what's your secret? You haven't been to a doctor in your life, you're jumping farm fences, you've got perfect cognition. He said, very simple, I've had a tablespoon of cod liver oil every day since I was 9. Cod liver oil is a remarkable supplement, and I'll talk about the things that can make it less remarkable and what to look out for. But cod liver oil at a tablespoon per day is a really remarkable. A tablespoon of cod liver oil, and we're talking about correcting a ratio that's 21 needs to be 2 to 1. A fish oil capsule, is nothing in terms of correcting that. A tablespoon of cod liver oil, which has the same percentages of EPA and DHA, the 2 very powerful fatty acids found in fish oil that makes it such a wonderful compound, has the same amount as 10 capsules. A capsule is usually 1.5, a tablespoon's 15 grams. And so you've got 10 capsules in a tablespoon. Now, my problem with taking cod liver oils, my grandmother used to punish me if I ever swore or did anything wrong by shoving cod liver oil down my mouth. And so I didn't like the taste of it, as many people don't. And then when I knew it was so good, I thought, I'll take it. Then I burped the taste of fish for about the next 2 or 3 hours. And I mentioned this in a course, and I mentioned that 96-year-old naturopath who shared the story of her tablespoon of coconut oil and an egg to control fleas and ticks. She stood up. She just attended the course. She was quite famous on the coast. She said, that need never happen again. Your secret is that you squeeze the juice of a lemon, have one of those little mechanised lemon juice squeezers, you just put it on, it spins and drains the lemon juice. And lemon juice is wonderful. It's got a whole range of benefits different to any other citrus. But anyway, you put that with the cod liver oil, it just tastes like a vaguely oily lemon juice. You can't taste fish at all, and you'll never have reflux again, and you don't. Wonderful little tip that I've shared with many people since she shared it with me. So that becomes your a very, very good way to correct. But other tag-ons, flaxseed oil is a salad oil, certainly not a cooking oil because it's omega-3 and that's so easily damaged. Flaxseed oil is 57%, but chia seed, Australia's now the largest producer, region in Kununurra in West Australia is now the largest producer in the world of chia, and it doesn't require many chemicals because it's so high in antioxidants and things that it's really quite a problem-free crop, so it's quite clean. You don't have to necessarily have organic, it's pretty clean. Chia seeds, 61% omega-3, highest known source of omega-3, but the list goes on and on. I mean, it's got, 4 times the antioxidants of blueberries, and it just goes on and on. It's a wonderful thing. So you put some chia in there. Now, the secret with chia, there's little tips for everything. The secret with chia is that you take your chia and you put it in some water and leave it overnight. And that initiates the sprouting process. So people were talking about sprouting earlier, and sprouting, of course, just magnifies. In fact, it doubles the antioxidant level in the chia because the whole biochemical pathway cascades in when it starts that 12-hour overnight soak. And now you put that in your green smoothie and you get this really big kick. Aside from the omega-3, you get in the others. And, of course, hemp seed oil. There's a remarkable... So there's a journalist. He's down on his luck. He's sitting at a park bench. He's lost his job, his wife, and his house. He's got a pen of paper in front of him, and he's saying, "Why me?" And the pen starts writing. The paper starts, so the story goes. And so I was born a book that ranks in the top 40 books in the English language called Conversations with God. And the journalist, of course, Neil Donald Walsh, in that first volume, God says to Neil, "What is wrong," theoretically, if you believe it, "what is wrong with you people? I gave you the perfect plant, and you'd made it illegal." And of course, he was talking about cannabis and its ridiculous potential on so many levels. And one of them is the importance. I mean, it's so ludicrous, the story of our understanding of fats. I mean, the food pyramid, this is nutritional science for 5 decades, has had the food pyramid with carbohydrates, 55% of our diet, protein and fat at the top there, the smallest thing in the pyramid. That's been reversed. I don't know if you understand that. The new food pyramid is a complete reversal where 50% of the calorific intake needs to be good fats on the bottom. So we've changed completely our understanding of nutrition and how it works. And when we look at hemp seed, you believe that God might have made that comment, because hemp seed oil is the perfect profile of fatty acids. It's the perfect balance of omega-6, omega-3, omega-9, gamma-linoleic acid, and several others. It's almost like you could make anything from that. Then you look at hemp protein. It's a very, very high quality protein. You've got protein, you've got fats, you've got oils. You've got the basis for any food. You could feed the world with it. But that's just the start. I mean, you probably know all the stuff about hemp. Aside from the fact that it's got 82 bioactives and our human cells have 82 receptors, there's nothing on this planet that has 82 and 82. It's like a key to the lock. There's nothing out there. There's things that have got 15 actives, and we've got three receptors for those actives. We've got 82 on 82, the cannabinoid receptors. It is insane, its potential from a medicinal point of view. But then we look at other things. We look at the largest, if we look at, the largest killer from a cancer perspective, we talked about dioxins and where do they come from. Well, the highest source of dioxins sort of polluting everywhere, to the point that Inuit women, their breast milk is considered a hazardous waste because they're eating fats, and it's fat soluble and it builds its way up the chain, so the walrus is packed with it on the farthest corners of the earth. So it's a it's a horror show. We say, where's the highest source of that causing that problem? It comes from bleaching softwoods to make paper. The largest source of dioxin contamination on the planet is taking softwoods. And here's the story on industrial hemp, comparable. You know how incredible a fibre it is. I've got a hemp shirt that's 27 years old. I use on the farm, still can't make a hole in it. It's the most powerful, strongest fibre known. The world was discovered on the strength of hemp sails and hemp ropes and so forth. The Magna Carta is on a hemp parchment that still exists in perfect condition all those many, many decades later. And so to make the equivalent amount of paper that it takes 20 years with a softwood plantation, and then you use dioxins to turn it white, you can do in 4 months with industrial hemp on the same area of land. So do the sums. That's 60 times more efficient. And you can't use, it won't operate with hemp to make it white. You use hydrogen peroxide, which is a natural substance our body makes. H2O2, it's a form of oxygen. I mean, why wouldn't we convert every sugar factory from here? You can grow 2 crops a year in Queensland. All of that worthless sugar that from here to cans could be converted to industrial hemp. Then we've got our second, I mean, there's so many things, it's ridiculous, and I'm digressing insanely. But we look at the second largest source of that thickening of the blanket that's trapping the heat and changing our world so dramatically to the point that we might not even be here if it continues. It's that serious. And we say the second largest contributor is concrete. Then we look at hempcrete, concrete, because you're burning calcium carbonate to create calcium oxide, and the carbon, of course, the carbonate, CO2 goes into the atmosphere. You use calcium carbonate with hemp fibre and a binder to make hempcrete. It's the most insulating of all building materials. It outperforms mud, brick and straw bale. It'll keep the warm in and the cold out, and you can't burn it. You can put Bunsen burners, you can put torches on it, and it won't burn. Is that good for the Australian landscape? And it actually accumulates, and I'm not sure of the pathway, but somehow it actually accumulates carbon in the process. So not only, so here you've got this wonderful building material, you can build whole freestanding walls. There's a company that does Meccano blocks, you clip them all together and you've got a hemp. My buildings on the new farm will all be made from hempcrete, but the potential for it's just mind-boggling. So maybe there was some truth in God's statement that I gave you the perfect plan. But anyway, good town to be talking about that. We'll keep moving. What can we shove into our green smoothies? Yeah, I mentioned hemp seed oil. Hemp seed could be a good contributor. The greens, alternate them. Kale, it's interesting. Who would think that sweet potato leaves have actually got more nutrition than that wonderful sweet potato, which is filled with nutrition, except for folic acid. There's always more folic acid in root vegetables, but everything else, beetroot leaves, more nutrition than that wonderful anthocyanin-packed bulb, which is a wonderful food, more in the leaves, and we throw it away. So now you start putting those leaves, sweet potato leaves, the beetroot leaves, into your green smoothie to pick up. Mulberry leaves, easiest tree to grow. Go to China and you'll find that just below sales of green tea is mulberry leaf tea. Why? Because they've got a massive issue with type 2 diabetes, growing issue. It's the fastest growing disease on the planet. 1 in 3 of us are pre-diabetic, they're saying now, globally, and that it's the coming plague. It'll be the biggest disease within a decade. But the Chinese have found that, and you want to see the research because I've looked, mulberry leaf tea is ridiculously effective at managing blood sugar. And so you take a couple of leaves off your mulberry tree and wake it in your green smoothie. Beetroot leaf we mentioned. Herbs, you can start using your herb garden. People will often just use a bit of parsley and that's it. You know, holy basil. The Indians say tulsi basil, they call it tulsi basil leaf a day keeps the doc away, and it's part of their health regime. Put a leaf into your green smoothie. Herb robert, who's heard of herb robert before? Not many of you. Grows beautifully in this region. Spouts out, it's a form of geranium, spouts out a little, squirts its little flower out, called crane's bill. It has this little crane's bill and it spits its flowers, so it'll go over to that chair. And it's a weed in New Zealand. You can drive from Auckland to Whangarei and it's on the sides of the roads and they don't realise what it is. But Isabel Shippard, the author of How I Can Use Herbs in My Everyday Life, she put out a list at one point of what she considered the 10 most beneficial of herbs, and that's caused a huge stir in the world of herbalists because number 1 was herb robert, and people said, what? You know, surely there's a dozen herbs that should be placed above that. But you want to go on Isabel's website that still exists and see the number of people who've gone on there with advanced breast cancer, forsaken by the medical community, who've drunk their herb robert tea 3-4 times a day and have got no evidence now of the tumours. It's all about something called germanium. Herb robert is a geranium species that is the most profound accumulator of a rare earth mineral called germanium. Just Google plant-derived germanium and cancer and you'll see what I'm talking about and understand why it might be a good thing to put into your garden. You can whack it in your green smoothie as I do each morning. You put some probiotics in there to speed the thing up. You can even start eating your weeds if you choose. Dandelion, the Latin name for dandelion means cure for all things. Dandelion is a wonderful herb. The leaves, the flower, the shoot, the roots, and you can whack a couple of dandelion leaves. They've got a bit of bitterness, but just a couple won't hurt. Chickweed, people fought on the streets for this stuff. Highest source or second highest source of vitamin C. When they first arrived in that first fleet, they had a drought the first season, and of course it weren't citrus, there was nothing growing. And scurvy was running rampant, and people discovered this was the secret not to get scurvy, and they fought to try and find this weed and over who was going to get that weed because it became so valuable. It tastes much better than hydroponic lettuce. Now, we mentioned how you can use this little tool, squeeze a little bit of the juice, you're measuring the dissolved solids, you're measuring the food value of what you're eating. Lettuce should have a Brix, the dissolved solids reading, degrees Brix of 12 and higher. 12 is the minimum that you want for a good quality lettuce. We have never tested a hydroponic lettuce above 1.5 degrees Brix. They are complete crap food, and you need to be aware of that. That's why hydroponic marijuana is crap as well in comparison to anything grown in the soil. And the part of the reason for that is that hydroponics based upon, there are two forms of nitrogen, nitrogen being the most abundant mineral within the plant, ammonium nitrogen and nitrate nitrogen, and hydroponics is only about one of them. And the problem with nitrates, if you've oversupplied it, which of course you have if that's all you've used, calcium nitrate, potassium nitrate, is part of the two-part formula that you feed in a hydroponic scenario, is that when you've overdone nitrogen, nitrogen's always uptaken with water and the plant doesn't stop. If it's there, it takes it up and that dilutes everything. The water that carries in the nitrates dilute everything else, and that's what the low Brix level, that's what the pathetic food value is of hydroponically grown food, because you only grew it with nitrates, you diluted everything, and that's what you're measuring. A lack of dissolved solids, a lack of nutrient density. So you don't eat hydroponic foods or smoke hydroponic dope for that reason. So, chickweed, wonderful. Purslane, who's seen this thing growing around anywhere? It looks like a little succulent. A great example, if you want to turn your home garden into the ultimate wellness tool, a really important thing to recognise is that you need to, and of course we had the Seed Savers people talking this morning. I mean, I got my passion for gardening from a grandfather who had a dairy farm who was a mad passionate, and I went spent every holiday on that dairy farm. He was a mad passionate veggie garden. Oh my God, it was veggie and fruit. It was just ridiculously delicious what he grew. But he would sit on the veranda, he would take the best pumpkin, the best tomato, the best bean. He would scoop them out and put them on, dry them out in the sun, and then he'd put them in little bags and label them all with the date and everything. He had a little metal filing cabinet so that mice wouldn't be able to eat the seed. And he grew, and what you're doing is taking the best of the best each season, your conditions, your soil type, and the next season you're putting the best of the best, and the next season the best of the best got better. By the time he was 60 and he took those seeds to a smaller acreage in town, and I had to walk past that acreage to go to school every day, he was feeding the entire neighbourhood with the most ridiculous food you've ever tasted. And the problem with the conventional seed model, where you go and buy some seedlings or go and buy some seeds, some yates, whatever, the problem, and this is exemplified, I'm just not digressing pointlessly as sometimes it might seem. I eventually find my way back. But in this instance, the problem with the idea of hybridisation is that people want to make money out of plants. And so you decide you want a certain set of characteristics that you can patent them because you own the hybrid. I mean, the biggest example of the failure of hybridisation has impacted our health immeasurably. So there's a bloke who was given the Nobel Prize, of course, for what's called the Green Revolution, when really he should have got a kick up the arse. And the story was simply, we had the open pollinated, the original wheat varieties that were falling. And climate change has been happening for 10 decades. It's just getting serious, and we're noticing it now. So there were extra strong winds, and they were falling down, no sand streams. It's called lodging. You can't harvest it. 27% of the world's wheat crop one year. And they said, we need to use the relatively new science of hybridisation, and we need to create a smaller plant instead of the big tall one that doesn't fall over and that's at least as prolific in terms of production. And so I'm just trying to think of his name. I've just lost his name, which I don't usually do, but anyway, I have. Norman. He cheated. He was a hybridisation expert. Everyone knew you get a Nobel Prize. Whoever could pull this off was going to get a Nobel Prize. So he irradiated a whole series, and he took a mutant, and that mutant has become our food source. Now, no one was told that in that process, an extreme form of hybridisation is fast-tracking the process, but no one was told that that new grain that is now predominantly the basis of most of the food that we eat, because we're also grain-dominant in our diets, takes up 50% less iron, 32% less calcium, 30% less magnesium, low 20s in trace minerals, 20% less, but one trace mineral can't uptake at all. And that trace mineral is called cobalt. And you might say, well, that's not a big deal, it's just an obscure trace mineral. Yeah, it's the building block for something called vitamin B12. And most of you in this room, if you have a blood test and check what your real ideal level should be, not based on the levels of averages of everyone who's already deficient, but where your level should be from a therapeutic perspective, most of you are deficient. And the reason for that is cobalt was the largest source of cobalt was from cereal grains when they could make cobalt from B12. And of course, without cobalt, you can't make when you can make B12 from cobalt, you can't make B12 without cobalt. My latest podcast covers the whole story of cobalt in much more depth. But anyway, that's just, so the deal is that when you hybridise, you lose something. I work with the largest strawberry growers on the planet in Holland. This is Strawberry Breeders. The two most popular strawberry varieties can't uptake manganese. That's the side effect. You've only got a certain number of genes in the gene pool, and when you decide you want some other set of characteristics that you can patent, you can't make more genes. You've got to move them around to do something you want them to do, and something suffers. And what usually suffers is nutrition on multiple levels, or sometimes just one thing. In the case of strawberries, one mineral they can't uptake anymore. You've got to foliar spray it. They can't take it from the soil. That's the story of hybridisation, and that's why in your ultimate wellness tool, you grow heirloom varieties that haven't been messed with. Now here's an example of messing with something, because here's this plant that is the highest omega-3 of any plant. So we talked about chia seed, that's a seed, we're talking about a plant. This is the highest omega-3 levels of any plant. This is the so-called weed. Gandhi's favourite food was purslane, beautiful in curries and so forth. And extremely alkalising. King Henry VIII, known for his excesses, including what he did to his 6 wives, he got gout all the time, and his trick was purslane tea. It's so alkalising it could neutralise the uric acid. Ridiculously high levels of vitamin A, and then you say, no, I like this plant, but we want to create a landscape plant from it that has, instead of the insignificant little cream flower, we want something with bright orange and bright purple flowers. And of course, that's a very popular landscaping plant, the hybridisation of purslane to create portulaca. Now, portulaca has 0 of the good things now. Sure, it's got the flowers. That's what hybridisation does. You want a set of characteristics that you patented, and now you've got to pay the patent for everyone growing that hybridised plant. But all of those things, that massive level of vitamin C, the huge levels of vitamin A, the alkalising, all that's gone. You've got the flower, but that's the price. So that's why you use non-hybridised, open-pollinated, and collect your seed. Take the best from the best and get better and better when you're growing your food. Plantain used to be considered a weed. They used to herbicide it out in New Zealand as a broadleaf weed, and now, of course, it's considered to be one of the greatest things you can put into your pasture. Wonderful, deep-rooted, anti-parasitic thing for livestock, but really good for humans. It tastes as good as spinach, probably slightly nicer. Very good weight loss tool, and very good at lowering blood pressure. Wandering Jew, now there's a white one that's poisonous, so you've got to be careful, but the leaf is very, very high in a whole range of antioxidants, including very good levels of vitamin C. So they can be whacked into your green smoothie. Just finished up on this segment, and then we'll cover a few little flashy things, quick things on agriculture before we wrap up. Just branching out into basically the search for peace and happiness. So I was impressed with Bronnie when she wrote this book. This is Bronnie here. Palliative nurse, spent many, many years, 20 years, just looking after people in their last 12 weeks of their life. So developed very close relationships with those patients, discovered that they had a lot to share, that very commonly a clarity comes through in those last weeks. But very commonly they had regrets, and they shared those regrets. She became their mate, sort of thing. So she thought, I'll write this book about the regrets of many, many of the people who die, and perhaps if we're aware that they're likely regrets, we'll do something about it so we don't go to our deathbed, which we will go to at some point, with those same regrets. One thing she noted, and I touched upon it yesterday, is that not a single dying person in hundreds upon hundreds of people in 20 years that she looked after, not one of them ever said they wished they'd made more money and bought more stuff. So it's quite a good, even Steve Jobs, of course, one of the richest men in the world, on his deathbed, he was renowned for being an asshole, basically. And on his deathbed he said, oh my God, I made a mistake. Life is about how you treat others and how you're remembered for that treatment. And whether you've got a $3,000 car or a $300,000 car makes 0 difference in your peace and happiness. I made a mistake. And those were his last words, so they say. But then, what's that say? Yeah, it's sad. So sometimes this clarity comes through. So she summarises the top 5 regrets. So number 1 was, I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself. And so what we're talking about in this instance is that you're born with you're born a blank program. And those first, Freud, I've got a degree in psychology, Freud would say, give me a child till he's 7, I've got him forever. Because those first 5 to 7 years are the formative years where so much is imprinted into that child, and so much of it, the journey of your life then becomes getting rid of a lot of that stuff, because most of that is based on expectations. It's huge amounts. It's so difficult parenting in that sense, because because, there's just this whole range of things. You shouldn't do that, you shouldn't, and it's not you, you are living someone else's expectation of you, and you start, hopefully, people realise that when that clarity comes through, oh my God, I didn't live my life. I was expected to do this, this, and this, and I did, and I didn't live a life true to myself. So be aware of that. If you're not passionate about getting up in the morning and saying, yeah, I'm into this. I discovered quite late in life how much I love farming. I always was a gardener, but I just love producing good quality food. Even though it's like it's like a hole to pour money into when you have all of the extremes and the hailstorms wiping out things and so forth, but it's just a wonderful thing to do. But if you're not excited when you get up in the morning and you're saying, oh, I'll be happy, in 15 years I'll retire, then I'll be happy, and so you just blew 15 years of your life. The really important thing to understand is that the journey of life is not about the end. The meaning of life is in the moment is the actual journey. And if you've 15 years you've sacrificed, you blew it. You've got to be passionate now. If you're doing something you're not happy doing, change it. And a lot of people had that kind of epiphany during COVID. But it really is important in terms of you've got one life, live it true to yourself. Very commonly people say they wish they'd been less work-obsessed. Now, it's difficult for me because I am work-obsessed, but my work is my passion, so it's hard to know where the balance is. But many people have sort of, now we've got women who've moved, and a lot of men said, I missed the kids, all that wonderful stuff that happens in those first 5 or 6 years. I wasn't even there most of the time, and now women are saying the same thing because both of them are working, trying to pay that mortgage, and the kids, they're not even enjoying that precious time with the kids and so forth anyway. They recognise that later on. I wish I'd had the courage to express my feelings. Of course, it's about being true to yourself. It's part of that same story almost, that you can say what you think rather than keeping quiet. And, the problem about bottling things up is the powerful science now of what's called psychoneuroimmunology, this recognition of the power of our thoughts and our feelings. And the most destructive of all, I had a professor talk again at one of my conferences on psychoneuroimmunology and the findings, the most destructive of all human emotions is guilt. So the Catholics got it right, 3 Hail Marys and the job's done, except they created the guilt by pretending you're a vengeful God, which isn't who God, anyway, I won't go there. But anyway, it was a good idea to have some way to absolve that guilt. But basically second, in terms of destructive emotions, and very, very commonly linked to cancer patients, hugely linked. This guy said, I've never found a cancer patient where it didn't apply. The second most destructive of human emotions is bitterness. And so the capacity where everyone who was ever tuned in, whether it was Buddha or Muhammad or Jesus, who suggested you've got to learn to forgive, they were right. You don't forgive, you're bitter. That's what forgiveness is about, not being bitter. And if you're bitter, bitterness will kill you at some point, we now understand. So not saying what you think is going to mean you're going to bottle things up and potentially get bitter, and that's not good for you. So a great thing about social media, of course, is that recognition at the end that, when you get to the end of a life, you recognise, well, gee, there's, sometimes there's only 4 or 5 people ever in your life that you could call true people that you connected with. And many of us had that in our formative years and early, and then we got married and we separated. Well, you never saw those people again, and you suddenly realised, oh my God, I've realised now, because it's the end, that there was only 4 or 5 of those, and I forsook 3 of them. But at least with social media, you can catch up with those people now, those really important people, and reclaim some of that. So John Lennon's statement, when I was 5 years old, my mother told me that happiness was the key to life. When I went to school, they asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I wrote down happy. They told me I didn't understand the assignment, and I said they didn't understand life. So that was John, of course. So, and that was the last of the things. I wish I'd let myself be happy. So one of the things you recognise is it's really just a state of mind. You can let yourself become a grumpy bastard. People often do, sort of 60 plus, and they just become this negative grumpy bastard, and their life becomes this negative grumpy thing. And the very simple thing in terms of a woman from the Sunshine Coast wrote the book The Secret, and the secret is very simply that you create your own reality, and you do. Just think about someone who's if you think about the link between gratitude and happiness, think of someone who's genuinely happy. If you know anyone who is, but someone who's fully happy and peaceful, are they grateful? Yes, they are. So even if women just nod because they intuitively feel these things, and men say, well, show me the evidence. Well, there's the evidence. Think of someone happy. Are they grateful? Yes, they are, because gratitude and happiness are inextricably intertwined. But just that whole, sort of digressing slightly, but, one of the biggest selling books in the last 2 decades has been The Power of Now, which, of course, then was followed up by a book called A New Earth by Eckhart Tolle. But nothing new, there's nothing new under the sun. And a great example of that was back when the Chinese had a wonderful philosophic tradition, we had Lao Tzu, who was wonderful. And 2,500 years ago, Lao Tzu said, I want you to think about your scenario. As I mentioned this, Lao Tzu said, if you live in the past, you'll be depressed. If you live in the future, you'll be anxious. Your only chance of peace and happiness is to live in the moment. And that's what the power of now is. He stole the idea. It's been around for a long time, but it's a very, very profound recognition of how things work. So that's that segment. If you want more of that, there's heaps of it on the Nutrition Farming podcast, and I'll go back to, I was just finding how to get there. Okay, so I'll flick through and just try, because we've only got half. Any questions at this point? You've had the normal drinking from the fire hose experience. There must be a few questions that have welled up. Yes? Yes, I can send through to Jenny and Paul. I can send through the PDFs and you can access them. I'll email them to you. I think I better check with Jenny and Paul first.
What was the herb they were fighting over in the first lead or whatever?
That's a weed called chickweed.
Chickweed,
yes,
okay.
Well, it's very commonly, it grows in veg garden, grows everywhere. Has a little star-shaped flower in it. But it's really nice. It's much nicer than hydroponic lettuce to just put in your salads. It's a really tasty thing. Okay, so we'll continue with the whole story of soil to planetary health.
Got a question here.
Yes.
Just a quick question. What was the organisation of the doctors who were against
antibiotics? So it's the Australian College of Nutritional and Environmental Medicine, so that what you Google was all capitals, ACNEM, and then they'll give you, there's 1,800 doctors that have had that training and all the stuff they missed out on in their formal training, and they become very passionate doctors because, realistically, they finish their training and they become glorified drug pushers. It's just what it is. You've got your 8 minutes with a person, you give them a drug. So they become much, much more passionate when they can actually heal people, which is what you signed up to. The Hippocratic Oath is about that. So I find them a wonderful group. They lecture at some of my things, I lecture at theirs and so forth. So great group. I've not seen a dud named doctor yet. I'm sure they exist, but most of them are really good, very passionate. Any other questions?
I got another question.
Yeah.
Where else can we get cobalt naturally?
Well, basically, B12 supplementation is something that most people probably should do. And one of the things that we don't really know the reason why, but there's a substance called intrinsic factor that governs the uptake of B12 once you've taken it orally. And for some reason, it'll be something that's been messed around for whatever reason, because there's not even really a theory of it, but many of us, and it's a really high percentage, don't have intrinsic factor or enough of it to absorb oral B12. That's why having injections is really an indication. You go in South Africa, you pay $25 and you go to a chemist shop and they give you a B12 shot and you go, oh my goodness, this is how I'm supposed to be feeling because it's so strongly linked to energy. But the secret with B12 supplementation is sublingual B12, so that bypasses it. You put it under your tongue and suck it up under your tongue. So that bypasses the intrinsic factor that most of us are lacking. No, put it under your tongue. You buy sublingual B12 and you put it under your tongue and take it in through your tongue, and that bypasses this thing. The supplement, no, it's straight sometimes, or you can buy a supplement that you just put under, a B12 supplement that you put under your tongue and you just take it up through the underneath of the tongue. That's okay, that's called sublingual, yeah.
It's great for animals too, because they're often cobalt deficient.
Yes, B12. B12 is part of most licks and so forth will combine either a little bit of cobalt or some B12 for that reason. Same story. Yes?
Hi, I've got the microphone now. Through farming, I've heard of fulvic acid and how that can help our ability to uptake nutrients, or the plant's ability. And then I've recently found that there's a dietary supplement that you can take, and I just thought what your take on that is.
Okay, so it's not through the TGA at the moment to take vitamin, to take fulvic acid as a supplement, but it is actually quite a invaluable supplement. It's very easy to, as I mentioned, I started talking about ChatGPT, the negative things, but you can go on ChatGPT and say, show me the research on fulvic acid in human health, and it'll be a whole 2 or 3 pages of summarised summaries into the value of fulvic acid. It can regenerate cells. It's really a remarkable thing. In the plant, the biggest benefit of both humic and fulvic acid, these natural acids that are made during composting or extracted in concentrated form from certain types of brown coal, their main thing is called cell sensitization, and it does the same thing in our bodies. It basically, nutrients go through the cell wall, and then there's a membrane, like that little membrane on the inside of an egg, and that's the centre point of everything, of what comes in and out of the cell. And calcium sits there like a doorman. That's why they call it calcium trucker of all minerals on our cells and in plant cells. So it's a very important thing at that membrane level. But basically what fulvic acid does is increase the permeability by 31 to 34%. So basically a third. Both humic and fulvic do it. It's called cell sensitization. So that you can uptake a third more of whatever you take if it's got fulvic acid with it, which is a huge thing in agriculture to magnify whatever you're using. Wonderful thing. I'll just talk about that membrane for one moment while we're still vaguely on the spiritual level. So a great mate of mine, I don't know if you've heard of Bruce Lipton before. Yeah. So Bruce is a great friend. We owned a farm together in New Zealand. And Bruce wrote a book called The Biology of Belief. So he's a cell biologist working at Stanford, and he's saying everyone's talking about, this genetic determinism, Watson and Crick won their 2 Nobel Prizes by understanding how genes work and so forth, and basically the model was that we're a prisoner of our genes and so forth. And so he started looking a bit more closely at how things were working. So the first thing he did was, and he took heart cells, interestingly, and you can keep heart cells alive sort of indefinitely if you clean the process and keep them with all the nutrients in a petri dish, which is what he did. And he stripped all the genes out of the heart cells. Well, they should have got, there's no messaging theory because that's where it's supposed to all happen. Well, the heart cells were alive a day later, a week later. They lived for something like 14 weeks. I can't remember the exact period. It was a very long period, which was impossible theoretically. So he then started looking deeper about how that might have been working. And of course, the whole action is around the cell membrane. And he found these receptors on the cell membrane, this little thing inside the cell wall, on all of our 10 trillion cells, and he found that basically they respond very much to what we eat. So we literally are, the biochemicals and so forth from our foods are picked up on those cell membranes and can have such an impact. And then, he's considered to be one of the founders of psychoneuroimmunology, he found that our emotions have even more profound effect upon the health of our cells and the health of us, because we are just a community of cells, and the membrane is the centerpiece for whatever thought we have, negative or positive, and emotion we have, negative or positive, including the problems with bitterness and so forth, is reflected at that membrane level. And then he finds one emotion that has more impact than anything you can do for your health at a cellular level. Guess what the emotion was? Yeah, love. What a finding. What an amazing finding. So, was there anything else I was answering before I digressed yet again? It probably does, because most things do, but it just will stain you completely. I mean, it's really, really intensive, a black or brownish, goldish brown stain that will stain you. But theoretically, it could go into. I mean, we do something called stock saver, which is humic and fulvic acid together with trace minerals in it. That it's wonderful for pet. I mean, it's just this insane thing. We can't say what it does on the label or anything because it's not legal, but Its effect on livestock is just mind-blowing. You can take a dog that's a 6-year-old and acting like a 16-year-old just laying around on the veranda, and you give it this 20 grams per 100 kilos of body weight, so it's not much, into its food, this black powder, and it's just this ridiculous energisation. We've got racehorse trainers, and I won't mention them, but some of them are the biggest trainers. They won't race their horse before they give it to them. They reckon if anyone knew, they won't tell anyone, they'd make it illegal, because that horse comes in, usually goes off its feed for a day after a hard race. They put the head straight in the feed bag, as so much of an energy generation happened with that hemiconfolvic. And people put it in capsules and take it. It's not legal, but people, and they make ridiculous claims about what can happen. So anyway, that's just... It's called Stock Saver. And the pet version is called Pet Saver. Just little containers. Yes? No, I haven't. I'm vaguely familiar with the concept, but I've not looked into it deeply. I'll need to. Yeah, I'll have a chat. I'll be interested. Okay, so I'll just flick through some slides and just see if there's anything that I think you need to know. I mean, we've talked about what's driven. We talked yesterday, for some of you wouldn't have been there, but we mentioned one of the bigger things is the fact that we're losing topsoil at 7 to 12 tonnes per hectare per year. And that's speeding up because we're getting all these extremes. That's what our rivers running brown and dust storms coating the entire eastern seaboard, as they did a few years back with the massive dust storm from South Australia. But particularly the rivers recently here, of course, we've seen them all running brown. That's topsoil and a massive loss of topsoil. And we mentioned the fact that we lost 2/3 of our humus. Well, part of the story is that. And why are we losing the topsoil? The primary reason is the humus loss, because humus is the glue that holds that soil together. But the other very important thing is that soil should never be left bare. And there will be legislation in the quite near future, because this is getting a desperate issue. 60 years, there's nothing at that current, and that was 5 years ago, that study. So 55 years, there's zero topsoil left. I mean, we hit the wall in 10 years at our current rate of loss. How do you grow food? You can't grow it hydroponically very successfully. You can't say, oh, no worries, mate, we'll just set up huge, big things. No, you can't. You can't feed 10 billion people hydroponically, and it's crap food anyway. Yeah. Well, even when you look at where we're heading in terms of food security, I mean, why is Bill Gates the largest landholder? Why is Dina Reinhardt the largest landholder here? Everyone knows where it's heading. Food is going to be so important in the equation. Anyway, topsoil is so much more valuable than gold and nickel, and it's the most important single thing on the planet. We need to develop a reverence for it, there's no doubt about it. We talked about our current model, just like we talked about the bankrupt model of putting more and more chemicals into our bodies, and now chemicals are our third largest killer. And I touched upon yesterday the finding that we've increased every year the chemical usage globally, 14.7% increase last year, 14.4, 14.1 the year before, 2 years before, 13.9, 13.6, every single year more and more chemicals, and every single year more and more pest and disease pressure. I mean, it's kind of a hiding to nothing. It's the definition of unsustainable. And I also mentioned the study of 14,000 school children in the US. You can't find it online now. I've got the copy of the original study, but you can't find it online. In fact, I can't even find it. They've put it somewhere, one of my PAs, and I've just got to search through and find where that, because I printed it, I thought they probably won't leave this up for long. 1,400 school children, the presence of the 13 most commonly used farm chemicals in the tissues, blood and urine of those kids, and they couldn't find one child of 1,400, 700 from towns, 700 from rural areas, who didn't have unacceptable levels of all 13 farm chemicals. The largest killer of our kids is childhood leukemia. There is no debates, there is no arguments about the relationship between environmental chemicals and leukemia. It's what causes leukemia, childhood leukemia. So it's a horror show in that context that, it bioaccumulates. There's little tiny residues that are there. The liver pumps them off and stores them in our fat, and that's part of what they measured in those kids, that tissue increase. And that's, anyway, the model doesn't work. Our food has become a shadow of what it used to be, and people are recognising that. There's multiple studies, multiple papers showing that it's half of what it used to have, and part of that was the green revolution, but there's a variety of other things mostly associated with how we treat the soil, how we hybridise and so forth. growing awareness that, well, what we eat and what we eat comes from a soil that's been compromised. So the starting point when you're growing stuff, and of course this is more directed for farm. How many of you are growing commercial? How many are farmers in the room? So, gee, there's only about 5. So this might be, I'll just flick through and find things that might apply to your own home food production rather than the more agronomy-based side of it. But basically, the concept of nutrition farming is getting back to root causes. What we've done is treat symptoms. We've done, as we mentioned, treating symptoms in human health, and we've put more and more drugs into the equation with less, and now, of course, they've become our third largest killer. The model doesn't work. We've done it with agriculture, more and more chemicals, less and less response. The idea, and of course, there's not as much money in it. That's why there's not a driver for it. But the idea, you've got a fungal disease. It's not a deficiency of a fungicide. Cancer is not a deficiency of chemotherapy. There's a reason. There's not bad luck, I got cancer. There's a reason for everything. You've got high blood pressure. You don't take blood pressure medication for the rest of your life, which you'll do, and the moment you come off, it takes 2.5 weeks till it rises back to where it was again. It doesn't cure. It's a substitute. It's just treating a symptom. And Google long-term effects of blood pressure medication, and you'll see that it's not a good thing to keep doing that. So get back to root causes. For one tiny example, blood pressure. What's the root cause of high blood pressure? Well, there are 4 things. Number 1, I'm digressing, but number 1, magnesium deficiency. Largest single deficiency out there, linked hugely to blood pressure. I was in, can't remember what country, South Africa, and I was in a little town just doing a human health course, so I just volunteered because I thought they needed it, and there's a big crowd. And these people come up to me afterwards and said, oh, you mentioned that link between magnesium and blood pressure. We've been on blood medication. One of them was 17 years, one was 12 years, another was 7 years. And we got a doctor who had some understanding of this. He said, look, we need to get back and not just keep you on this stuff. And so they did transdermal magnesium, just had them do an Epsom salts bath, and down, that's there. Check your contraindications, the sheet inside your blood pressure medication, and you'll see, do not take magnesium when you're taking this. And that's acknowledging that's the root cause. If you're already taking a synthetic way of bringing down your blood pressure, you take magnesium on top, but then you get low blood pressure. So you can't take, and it's just acknowledging what the problem is. So you just need to know this stuff. And how do doctors even follow it if they don't do nutrition? That's why those acronym guys are so good, because they understand this stuff. So anyway, second thing with high blood pressure is kidney health. And one of the reasons that I always put heaps of parsley into my rainbow sauerkraut is because you've now fermented it and you've magnified that effect. But I mentioned that elderly naturopath. She gave me quite a few little tips on things, but one of those was she said that 47% of her clients, and we're talking about 70 years in naturopath and very famous on the coast, 47% of her clients, she had estimated, the source of their high blood pressure was kidney malfunction. The kidney's not doing what they should do. And the most powerful herb for kidneys, and a kidney tonic, by far is parsley, the most common herb that we have in our garden. So you chop it up and you make yourself quite a decent amount, like a couple of sprigs chopped up, and then you pour hot water on it in a mug and you wait for 10 minutes. It's called steeping, and that's what herbal teas are about. And then you drink that, and you do that 3 times a day for 2 weeks. And she's saying in 60% of her clients, that fixed their blood pressure. So that's a hell of a tip if that's your root cause. So just little things that you can keep in mind, getting back to root causes. The third source of high blood pressure, often commonly linked to high blood pressure, is called high homocysteine. Who's heard of homocysteine before? So only 2 of you. When you go to the doc's nest, for 3, 4 of you, when you go to the doc's nest, you ask for a homocysteine test. Now, I'll quickly explain what homocysteine is. It's an amino acid that has a whole variety of roles, but when it's done, and it needs to be recycled. And the recycling involves something in your body called methylation. And methylation involves 3 nutrients called methyl donors. And if you're lacking in 1, 2, or 3, sometimes it can be all 3, but if you're lacking in 1, 2, or 3 of them, and you can't recycle homocysteine, it turns into the most vicious and most destructive known free radical. They thought that it just attacked the inside of your arteries. They now realize it attacks every organ. So homocysteine levels, you need to be below 7 when you go to the doctor and get your check. check where you're at. You'll find I checked, I was 17, so I had to do something about it. What are the three nutrients and why don't you know anything about it? Because there's no money in them. There's zero money in them. And 3 nutrients are B6. Why would you be deficient in that? Because you're all stressed and you suck B6 all the time when you're stressed. B12, you've got no cobalt to build B12. And folic acid, we virtually acknowledge that folic acid is deficiency because pregnant women have got to have the injection of folic acid so they don't give the baby spina bifida. Because folic acid is in the outer part of everything. Now, 89% of bread sold in this country is still white bread. When you take white wholemeal flour and convert it to white, you take 87% of the folic acid from it. Folic acid is in brown rice, it's not in white. It's in skins of things, not in the internal area. So many people are to some degree deficient in folic acid, but you've got 3 that quite likely we're going to be deficient in. You only need to be one of them missing, and you'll have high homocysteine with all the much more damaging than cholesterol ever was. I interviewed the world leader, Professor Willem Fontaine, Professor of Heart Medicine at Pretoria University. It's one of my interviews, and you'll see the story on it. Ask for the test, check it, and do something about it. Pretty simple, just supplement with those 3 things, but not for people say, I did B vitamins for a week. You did nothing, mate. It took you months to get there. I tested. I was 17 when I'd finished interviewing Willem Fontaine. I thought I'd better check myself just to see. 17, how long does it take to get down to 7? Well, I paid for the test because they wouldn't do it under Medicare every month just to see how long it took. And I took the 3 plus a B group vitamin. You've got to take 4 tablets because the B groups don't work by themselves. So you've got to have a B group supplement with everything to make the others work. So it's 4 tablets, B6, B12, folic acid, and a B group. I did that twice a day, and at 6 months I was down to 9. That's how long it takes. So don't ever think you do it for a day and the job's done. It's not fast food medicine. It took you a while to develop a deficiency. It takes a minimum of 3 months to correct it. Really important to understand that. Okay, so we're talking about minerals, microbes, and humus when we talk about what I call nutrition farming. Yeah, so hydration is part of that story, very important. There's a book called The Body's Many Cries for Water, written by a very, very good scientist who worked with Alexander Fleming. And basically, he just demonstrates that so many of us have got cellular dehydration. Now, one of the keys to hydration, just Google the word SOLE. It's S-O-L-E with a dash across the top of it. It's the concept of taking 1 part salt to 4 parts water, which is saturation point for the salt. So you make up a jar. I bring in a salt we call Nutrisalt. It's used in Ayurvedic medicine. It comes from one mountain called the Indupu mountain range, and I brought it back and tested it. Oh my God, it's got all 74 minerals, and it tastes like all the chefs use it. It's wonderful flavour, but wonderful medicinal salt. They use it in 23 preparations. And as part of the Ayurvedic thing is that you make this concentration of 1 part to 4 parts salt, and then you just leave it in a jar. You don't have to put it in the fridge. Nothing's going to come into that kind of concentration. You know that you've reached saturation point because there's some solids, a little bit of salt undissolved on the bottom, and you just put 1 teaspoon in your bottle of water, and you can barely taste it, but it makes the water so much more drinkable. But cellular hydration is about sodium and water. It's not just about water. It just magnifies how well you're hydrating with that water by having that little bit. Of course, you've got all the 74 minerals in there as well. So it's a little bit like an electrolyte, but it's only a tiny amount, but it's basically the relationship between salt and water and hydration, basically. So you can see I can just talk forever, and that's what my 5-day course is about. I just talk about everything, whatever comes into my head. So it's almost like I'm channeling sometimes. It just pours through. Anyway, we'll continue. Leaf testing, again, I'll flick through these things because if you're not farming, it's not really so relevant, but leaf testing is just, basically you're just asking with a tissue test, because there's so many things that impact what actually gets into the plant, that a tissue test is just saying, what do you want, plant? Oh, that's what you want, and then you bypass the problems in the soil and you foliar spray whatever's required. And growing things commercially, you just test before flowering, because that's the business end of the season when you're going to make your money. What do you want, plant? Oh, I see, and then you give it to it. It's just so basic, and so many people don't do it. But you discover things you wouldn't think. That's just an example on the salt test. You can't see the figures. That it's got plenty of magnesium in there, ideal levels, and yet it's deficient in magnesium. That's pretty important because the centerpiece of chlorophyll, which drives everything, photosynthesis is based on chloroplasts, and the centerpiece of the chloroplast is magnesium. So you don't want to be magnesium deficient. You just need some mag sulfate, mix it with fulvic acid, which collates and magnifies it, foliar spray it out there and the job's done, but you would never know unless you'd tested. So I don't know how much of this will cover. Just one little thing that home gardeners don't know. What you want to do is maximise your access to what's called the free gift. So the free gift is 74,000 tonnes of nitrogen gas hovering above every hectare, the most dominant gas in the atmosphere. And you're supposed to get some of that stuff, and that involves organisms, and most of you are thinking, oh yeah, that's those little guys live in the nodules of legumes. That's half of nitrogen fixation. The other half is called free living nitrogen fixers. They're crowded around the roots waiting for their daily feed of sugar, and in return for that, they make an enzyme called nitrogenase, which grabs the gas and converts it to ammonium nitrogen in the soil, and that's a really important way. And that's happening even on the leaf surface. The plant's spitting out carbon exudates, feeding this army of organisms on the leaf surface, that one of which is azotobacter that fix nitrogen. So there's this whole thing, but they can't do it without one mineral, and that mineral's never been put into home garden fertiliser. We do it, but no one else ever does. And that little trace mineral is called molybdenum. And why? Because nitrogenase, the enzyme that does that, is made from molybdenum. And no, if you don't put it back, it's not going to be there. It's very leachable. It only stores on humus. It's an anion that can only store on humus. And we've lost two-thirds of our humus. So molybdenum in just tiny amounts, 30 grams per litre. So it's going to be like a quarter of a teaspoon that you might foliar spray on your crop. If you could get hold of sodium molybdate, you use one of our products that has good levels of molybdenum. But it's just stuff that people don't know, and they need to if they're trying to produce a truly medicinal, high-quality food. There's another whole segment on ratios. I'll click past those. This is just an idea of, this is a thing called Mulder's chart. This is just demonstrating how minerals impact each other. And if you've done too much phosphorus by putting on too much chicken manure, you can see that the negative line is antagonism. It negatively affects the uptake of zinc. It negatively affects the uptake of copper. It affects all-important calcium, the shell strength of calcium. Just because you overdid phosphate, it affects iron. It affects potash. Just by overdoing too much dynamic lifter, which almost every home gardener does. So it's all stuff that's more agricultural, but it's still super relevant for you as well. There's everything, this is just antagonism, not stimulation, because some minerals stimulate other minerals, but this is antagonism. Everything in this quartile affects everything else in this quartile. So if you've got a tight, closed, high magnesium soil, then it affects the uptake of calcium and it affects the uptake of potassium, the money mineral that governs the size and health of things. If you've got a red soil, it's red because of iron oxide, which means it will seriously affect the uptake of manganese and zinc. And so you just understand everything in that quartile affects everything else in that quartile. If you overdo gypsum to try and open up your clay soil, then it shuts down phosphorus and nitrate nitrogen. So it's just, and it's all about balance, as is everything in life. So I won't spend too much time on getting into great detail about those things. We'll just see what we could. This is just one interesting thing. When you do tissue testing, that's what a tissue test looks like. This is just a ryegrass pasture test. There's different levels that are ideal for each test. And what has been discovered, and it's a great mate of mine, Gary Zimmer, who shared the discovery, and then I was responsible for showing that it didn't just apply to pasture, that it applied to every known species, and we call it the Big Four. Gary found that 4 minerals govern resilience, productivity, and your stress factor when you're farming and your need for chemical intervention. If you can maximise those 4 minerals, watch what happens to your crop and your yield. And the 4 minerals are phosphorus, I mean obviously calcium. Calcium's the trucker of one, it's got to be there. Phosphorus, photosynthesis begins with the battery of all life called adenosine triphosphate, which generates every enzymic reaction. And every thought you make, every breath you take, sounds like a sting song, is driven by the battery of life, which is ATP. So it's considered that even what they call life force and prana and chi may well be ATP in terms of the scientific explanation of it, because it literally drives everything. But photosynthesis is all phosphate-based compounds, so there's no reason, there's a good reason why you overdid it, because if a little bit works more, let's put more on in the home garden scenario, because it is hugely important. Phosphorus, you can't make sugars without it. Photosynthesis is a whole range of enzymes. All of them have got a phosphate base. So calcium and phosphate have to be there. Calcium, the trucker of all minerals. Phosphate, you can't photosynthesize without it. Magnesium has to be there because it's the centerpiece of chlorophyll. So that they are obvious. Phosphorus, because the most important process on the planet, the most important process of anything, because it's where we all come from, the building block of the of glucose, the building block of all carbon chemistry, including you, is photosynthesis, nothing more important. So we can see why phosphorus, magnesium and calcium would be there, because calcium governs the uptake of all the things that give you blotches and pale colours and stripes, so we want to keep our calcium levels good. We can understand it, but the fourth one's a surprise. You would think, well, nitrogen is the most abundant mineral. Potassium drives the size of things. That's got to be there, but it's not. The fourth one is a real surprise. It's a little trace mineral called boron. And the reason for boron's inclusion in the big four, surprising inclusion in the big four, is that calcium, the most important of all minerals, is the governor of cell strength, the governor of cell division, all sorts of things, the governor of soil structure and opening that soil with calcium. Calcium doesn't work without boron. Calcium just, it doesn't, the saying, calcium is the trucker of all minerals, is incomplete. The complete saying is, calcium is the trucker of all minerals and boron is the steering wheel. There's no point in alignment if you haven't done boron, because it won't, if you've got boron deficiency, because calcium doesn't do what it does. Even if you look at the protective capacity of calcium in terms of that cell wall strength, it's based on a substance called calcium pectate that creates this armour-like substance that stops fungal disease in insects, or at least deters them. You can't make calcium pectate without boron. So boron is leachable, the only thing in the soil that can hold it, because it's called a negatively charged mineral called an anion. The only thing that can hold it in the soil is humus, and we lost 2/3 of our humus. So, and we never put boron in. And many home gardeners, when did you use boron? I mean, most farmers know. You grow avocados. I mean, the importance of boron is profound there. You've got this massive amount of flour and this small amount of fruit, smallest fruit to flower ratio of any crop. You put 2 kilos of boron through fertigation and 2 kilos as a foliar, flowering, and you double your fruit to flower ratio. They're the heaviest users of boron of any crop, but there's lots of fruit that love boron, but avocados are right up there at the top. So it becomes one of the big four. But what's sad about this story is that this is 1 in 3 of all the leaf tests that we look at in the 57 countries we look at. Not only, see, when I talk about a luxury level, that's the guidelines on a good leaf test will tell you where you need to be for that crop. So you can see here for phosphorus, you need to be between 0.2 and 0.5. So a luxury level is up there on that line. The top end of acceptable, that's a luxury level, that's 0.5. What this guy's got is 0.15. So he's not even in the box, let alone it's a luxury level. He's deficient in all-important phosphorus, which is going to make a big difference. Calcium, the ideal 0.2 to 0.6. Well, we want 0.6. What has he got? There's his level. He's got 0.11. He's got a real deficiency of that important mineral. Magnesium, 0.16 to 0.4. We want 0.4. That's luxury. What's he got? 0.14. So he's got a quarter of the magnesium that he needs. Boron, for this crop, it's different for every crop, 5 to 15. He's got 3. Well, he wants 15. He wants to be up here. That's the big four. That's where everything kicks in, and you do so well when you're growing stuff. But what's sad is this is 1 in 3. Not only are you not even in the zone in terms of acceptable levels, but you're deficient in the 4 most important minerals for the most important process. And you're not having fun in farming. You're saying, oh my God, this is stressful. And you don't even know. So I've made it my life's work to make sure you do know. So on that note, we'll wrap up and take questions. Thanks for listening. Nutritech Solutions, NTS. Nutritech, T-E-C-H, Solutions, yeah. So it's called the Nutrition Farming Podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, there's hundreds of thousands of listeners now. It's turned into some kind of monster, but it is great fun. People kind of get addicted to it because you've sat there for 3.5 hours and enjoyed it. 3.5 hours every session. So, yeah. And it's got some of my humour. I'll give you some kind of humour just to wrap up, just to see if you can handle it. I don't know that you can. I don't know how politically correct or what you can handle, so you test crowds out. What jokes shall I tell you? Okay, so there's a bloke getting married on a Saturday, big decision. He's not been married, he's in his mid-30s, and he's driven out the countryside to consider this huge decision. He's getting married the next day. Stops at a little deserted roadside cafe. He's drinking his coffee and he's thinking, well, I can count 32 friends and family that have been married, since I turned 18, and I've either had invites to the wedding or I sent a present if I couldn't make it. And then he counts the divorces, and at 17, he's thinking, oh my God. And unfortunately, I don't know if you're familiar, but Australia's got the highest divorce rate in the world. 40% of first marriages end in divorce. You think, well, I've learnt my lesson. 60% of second marriages end in divorce. You think, third time lucky. 80% of third marriages. And so he's thinking those kind of thoughts. And then he notices at the end of this cafe is an elderly couple in their 80s staring lovingly into each other's eyes and holding hands. And he thinks, oh my God, why has the universe put up some people who have obviously made the long haul? And then he overhears the conversation. You can't help but not overhear it because they're quite hard of hearing and they're talking loudly. And he hears the gentleman say to the woman, do you realise where we are at the moment? She said, of course I do. This is the spot almost 60 years ago to the day that we were coming home from the wedding ceremony to the honeymoon hotel. Back in the day when you didn't make love before marriage, we were burning with desire for each other. We remembered that there's this little sort of tree-enclosed area that's private, only a few locals know about, that's often a place for lovers' trysts and things, but it's at the back of this cafe. So we stopped, full moon, under the moonlight, we made love for the first time. And they giggled at that memory. And then a sparkle came into the old boy's eyes. And he said, do you reckon you're still up for it? And she said, yeah, I reckon I am. And this bloke's thinking, what? As he sees them walk out to this little area. And he's sitting thinking, well, why would the universe throw this up? Maybe there's something I can learn. You don't sort of get voyeuristic, watch that 80-year-old. But he decides he's going to, they've been here for a couple of minutes before him. He walks out, there's a vine enclosed archway, pulls back the vine, he pokes his head round. The sight that greets his eyes shocks him to his core. The lady has pulled her skirt down, she's bracing herself on the fence, the gentleman has his and they're involved in the most energetic lovemaking he's ever seen or even thought was vaguely possible. There's bucking and thrusting and screaming and bucking and thrusting. He thinks this will be over in a minute. 15, 20, 30, 40. He walks back in 3/4 of an hour later, sits down to the dregs of his coffee and thinks, oh my God, if this is the secret, I'm finished. I can last 5 minutes sober, 10 minutes drunk. I'm just talking about myself here. No, I'm not. And then they come walking back in again, pretty dishevelled, as you can imagine. The old boy goes to the toilet and he thinks, I'll probably get a punch in the mouth for it, but I'm going to go in and ask him, what's the secret? Old boy standing at the urinal. He walks in, explains himself. Hell of a cheeky thing to have done. The old boy says, come here, son. He leans forward thinking he's probably going to get a punch in the mouth. And the boy says, 60 years ago, that bloody fence went electric. Okay, so I'm going to head back now, unfortunately. I've got a whole bunch of things back at the coast, so nice to chat. No last questions? Thank you for listening. I do talk more slowly on the podcast.
Well, that's amazing that you've done 3.5 hours. I just walked in earlier and it's like, is the same guy still talking or has he come back? Good on you.
Please thank once again Graeme Sait. Dinner is now available out on the veranda cafe here at the hall. Dinner's now available and there's music tonight here from 7 o'clock.